It started with a car wash. Not a metaphor. An actual car wash, a small, unremarkable service station in the city of Brasilia that investigators believed was being used to launder money. The kind of business that exists on every street corner in every city in the world. The kind of place nobody looks twice at. Brazilian federal police began pulling on that thread in March 2014. What they expected to find was a modest local money laundering operation. What they actually found was something so vast, so deeply embedded inside the most powerful institutions in Brazil, that investigators themselves struggled to comprehend its full scale as they uncovered it. At the center of it all sat Petrobras, Brazil's state-owned oil giant, one of the largest companies in the entire world, a national symbol of Brazilian pride and economic power. A company that had, for years, been operating as something closer to a private ATM for politicians, construction executives, and organized crime operatives who had figured out how to systematically steal from it. The total amount looted? Investigators eventually estimated somewhere between $2 and $5 billion, siphoned out through a bribery scheme so sophisticated, so normalized within the culture of Brazilian business and politics, that many of the people inside it had stopped thinking of it as crime at all. Operation Lava Jato car wash became the most significant legal investigation in Brazilian history, and arguably one of the most consequential anti-corruption prosecutions anywhere in the world in the last 30 years. What began as a regional money laundering inquiry in Curitiba, a mid-sized city in southern Brazil, eventually implicated multiple sitting presidents, dozens of senators and congresspeople, the heads of Brazil's largest construction companies, and executives at the highest levels of Petrobras. It triggered the impeachment of one president, the imprisonment of another, and a political earthquake that reshaped Brazilian democracy in ways the country is still processing today. But this story is not just about Brazil. The corruption that car wash exposed reached into boardrooms and government ministries across Latin America, and implicated international banks and construction firms operating far beyond Brazilian borders. It was a systemic failure of institutional oversight that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. The machine behind the oil. To understand how the scheme worked, you need to understand what Petrobras represented to Brazil. Founded in 1953, Petrobras was not just a company. It was a monument, a symbol of Brazilian self-sufficiency, national pride, and economic ambition. When massive deep-water oil reserves were discovered off the Brazilian coast in the late 2000s, Petrobras became the centerpiece of a national dream, the idea that Brazil was finally going to take its seat among the world's great economic powers. The Brazilian government held a controlling stake. That meant Petrobras's contracts, its purchasing decisions, its executive appointments, all of it flowed through the political system. And somewhere along the way, a group of people realized that this arrangement created an extraordinary opportunity. The scheme that investigators would eventually map out was elegant in its ruthlessness. Brazil's largest construction and engineering companies, the firms winning the enormous contracts to build Petrobras's refineries, pipeline, and infrastructure, had quietly formed a cartel. They coordinated bids to ensure contracts were divided among themselves at inflated prices. The overcharging built a hidden pool of money. That money then flowed, through a network of shell companies and corrupt middlemen, as bribes to Petrobras executives and to the political parties that controlled the company's board appointments. Everyone in the chain got paid. The construction executives got guaranteed contracts. The Petrobras officials got personal enrichment. The politicians got campaign funds and cash. And the Brazilian public, whose national company this technically was, got systematically robbed. One judge, one city, one thread. When the investigation landed on the desk of federal judge Sergio Moro in Curitiba, it was still a relatively contained money laundering case. Moro was 41 years old, quiet, methodical, and possessed of a reputation for handling complex financial crime. He had studied the Italian anti-mafia prosecutions of the 1990s closely and understood something that many of his colleagues did not, that in cases of systemic corruption, the only effective strategy is relentless forward momentum. He used every legal tool available. Plea bargains, which were relatively new to Brazilian law, became his primary instrument. Arrest a mid-level operator. Offer reduced sentencing in exchange for testimony. Use that testimony to reach the next level. Then the next. Then the next. The first major cooperating witness was Alberto Youssef, a black market money dealer who had been involved in moving bribery payments for years. Youssef, facing serious prison time, began talking. His testimony pointed investigators toward Paulo Roberto Costa, a former Petrobras executive. Costa then cooperated, and from Costa's testimony, the full architecture of the scheme began to take shape for the first. What emerged was not just a corruption case. It was the anatomy of a system that had been so thoroughly normalized that its participants had developed their own terminology, their own internal accounting, and their own code of conduct. The bribery payments even had a name inside the cartel. They were called the propina, the kickback, and they were budgeted into construction contracts as a standard line item. The names nobody expected to hear. By 2015, Operation Car Wash had moved from business executives into the heart of Brazilian political power. Executives from Odebrecht, Brazil's largest construction conglomerate and one of the biggest in the world, began cooperating with investigators. What they described was a bribery operation of almost incomprehensible reach. Odebrecht had paid bribes not just in Brazil, but across a dozen countries in Latin America and beyond, systematically corrupting government officials wherever it operated to secure contracts and eliminate competition. The company had maintained an entire internal department referred to internally as the Structured Operations Division, dedicated exclusively to managing illegal payments. It had its own encrypted communications system, its own accounting, its own staff. Corruption for Odebrecht had been industrialized. Back in Brazil, the names attached to the investigation grew more significant with every passing month. Senior figures from multiple political parties were implicated. Campaign finance records were shredded. Assets were seized. And then investigators reached the name that changed the temperature of the entire country. Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Lula, the former president of Brazil, one of the most popular political figures in Latin American history. The man who had lifted millions of Brazilians out of poverty during his presidency from 2003 to 2011. The man that many Brazilians considered a national hero. Here is where Operation Car Wash becomes something more complicated than a straightforward story of justice prevailing. Sergio Moro, the judge who had built the entire prosecution, resigned from the bench in 2019 to become Minister of Justice under newly elected President Jair Bolsonaro, the right-wing politician who had risen to power, in significant part, on the wave of anti-corruption sentiment that Car Wash had generated. The timing struck critics as deeply uncomfortable. Then, in 2019, The Intercept Brazil published a series of leaked messages that appeared to show Moro had coordinated strategy with prosecutors during the Lula investigation, something that, if true, would represent a serious breach of judicial impartiality. Moro denied wrongdoing, but the messages raised questions about the investigation's integrity that could not be easily dismissed. In 2021, the Brazilian Supreme Court ruled that Moro had been biased in his handling of the Lula case. Lula's convictions were annulled. He was freed, his political rights restored. In 2022, he ran for president again. He won. The man that Car Wash had put in prison was now back in power. The judge who convicted him had become a politician. And the systemic corruption that had sparked the entire investigation? The construction cartel, the bribery networks, the Petrobras scheme, many of the mechanisms that enabled it were still structurally intact.